welcome to this new iteration of Feminist Takes. My name is Laura Amann and I'm part of the curatorial team of Kunsthalle Wien. And today I will actually give a very short overview on the timeline of today's event and some practical and technical information. So part one of Feminist Takes will consist of a short introduction by Nataša, one of the directors of Kunsthalle Wien and part of VHW Collective. And after that, we will hear a few words and thoughts on early works by film director Želimir Žilnik himself. And this second part will consist on 5 different takes on this movie. So that's it from now, from my side. And I wish you a very enjoyable introduction and viewing to works, Feminist Takes.
Thank you, Laura, for this intro. Thank you, everyone, for being here on this beautiful sunny day, at least in Vienna, where I'm speaking from. So this iteration of Feminist Takes was actually really quite a long time in the making. And there was a moment when we were almost ready to go out, but then Corona, like so many other things, intervened. So here we are now again, a few months later, and in my introduction, I just want to say a few sentences about the exhibition that we did of Želimir Žilnik entire work, and why we did it, and a few sentences about the film, early works, which is at the focus of today, and why did we thought, and why this iteration of Feminist Takes was really important for us, that it takes part within the exhibition. So exhibition opened in October and in the meantime is already closed. So as I said, this particular iteration of Feminist Takes got postponed, but we really thought it's crucial and very important to have it within the mediation and public programs related to the exhibition. So the exhibition that we curated, in Kunsthalle Wien, it was actually the second version of the exhibition called Shadow Citizens. The first time we made it in 2018 in Editrus Media House in Oldenburg in Germany. And then in much bigger space and with this time that passed in between in Kunsthalle Wien. But definitely in both iterations, it was outside of the context of Yugoslavia, where Želimir work was much discussed, and it's in some circles, in cultural circles, rather important and pretty much known. So we devised an exhibition for this other context, and the central notion, maybe the central position from which we started, was basically Želimir's generosity and towards his protagonists and his involvement with his protagonists. So the title was Shadow Citizens, and in a way it reflected Žilnik's lifelong focus on invisible, suppressed, underrepresented, misrepresented members of society, or actually those who are not even members because they are excluded from society. And this focus runs parallel to the themes that he was dealing with in his films. And these are the questions of shadow economies, of borders, of migration, labor, terrorism, revolutionary fatigues, etc., etc. This concept of shadow citizens was important to us also as a form of political engagement, as a kind of possibility of a critique and affirmative reply to the notion of professionalized politics and generally expert knowledge, which is basically based on supposedly unideological, objective and data-driven facts and rules, and in a way displaces and replaces democratic debates. So this was also important thrust in the exhibition. And the exhibition was structured around a series of short inserts from a number of Želimir's films. And for this, we are really very grateful to Želimir that he allowed us to basically cut his films And we chose the inserts that we thought, in a way, give an insight into the complexities and the richness of his filmic opus. And around that, then we built a special interest in his TV production from the 80s, or the position of female characters in his films, or the notion of migration, notions of labor, many other facets that were important for us to stress in the exhibition. Also the notion of music, or the notion of performativity in his films. And in this constellation of the exhibition, Early Works was, of course, a very important film for us. And this is generally one of, considered to be one of the most important Želimir films. So the film is from 1969. And for us, we took it as a film that gives very important insights into the level and quality and content of cultural debates and cultural life in Yugoslavia at the time, which of course also sheds light on discussions on censorship, artistic autonomy in liberal democracies as well, historically, but of course also in the present. So this is one of his key films. It recounts the story, we will see the film shortly, but it recounts the story of a group of young people, 3 men and 1 woman, who took part in student demonstrations in Belgrade in 1968, and then decided to oppose the bourgeois routine everyday life and go to the countryside to enlighten and inspire the people, to wake up people's consciousness, to inspire the revolution. And the film ends up with the character, female character Yugoslava after being abused in a number of ways, being killed and burned. The film was in '69, when it was already part of the official competition for Berlin Film Festival. The film got censored in Yugoslavia. And it really initiated very important debates on the nature of and the role of film, specifically what was to be called black film in a Yugoslav cultural landscape. And this black film was a derogatory term which kind of accused Želimir Žilnik and many other filmmakers associated with this movement for presenting Yugoslav reality in a very dark undertones, something that is kind of falsely presenting the socialist reality of life. Želimir Žilnik was individually called to court where he defended himself, and this is really a very famous case. In film, he uses a number of quotes from Marx and Engels, and especially early Marx. And in his defense, because Želimir, before he became filmmaker, he was studying law. So was not only was versed in law and also versed in Marxism. And he defended himself very skillfully and basically called the prosecution, called them for not taking Marx seriously, because he didn't represent reality. He spoke with Marx and through Marx, giving the voice to his protagonists. And he concluded that the only possible offense that he may have done is that the film itself is artistically a failure, and that is certainly not something for prosecution to decide. Nevertheless, this was a successful defense. Nevertheless, the film was censored in Yugoslavia. It was shown publicly for the first time in 1987, so a number of decades later. But at the same time, it was shown in Berlin, and it got a Golden Bear award. And it is and a number of debates on the film and on the nature of and politics of film and autonomy of art and the way how Žilnik film escapes the usual dichotomy between regime artists, cultural apparatchiks, just following the optimistic visions that Yugoslavia Communist Party is supposed to be asking for, against the rebellious group of artists who are dissidents. His film certainly complicates, very much complicates this simple dichotomy that is still in many ways kind of dominant view on the cultural politics of Yugoslavia and of socialist countries in general. His position is neither official nor dissident discourse, but more kind of critique of socialist reality that aims for critical reinvigoration of the socialist discourse. So this fact that he is using, he is not showing deviations, deviations from proclaimed optimism of socialist life, but actually uses Marx to speak through the mouth of his protagonists was the strongest defense. And this debate about black art also, as Boris Budin analyzed it in a way, was before postmodernism already rooted in a culturalization of politics in which Communist Party was only concerned with how Yugoslavia will be presented culturally from the future, because the limits of real emancipation that socialist revolution promised were already reached. So these are all very important elements, and the film was really widely discussed along those lines. But what was completely missing is really the history of feminist reading of not only that film, but of generally Black film and New Yugoslav film in general. And this is really a gaping hole, a blind spot of all these discourses that Feminist Takes is addressing, not trying to address, but actually really addressing. To what degree this black hole is present is, for example, there is this fascinating document. It's a cultural magazine, Rock, which was published a year after the film was issued. And it includes 40 voices debating the film and its merits and criticizing it from different voices. And this was published, this was done together with Branko Vučićević, who co-wrote the script for the film, together with Bora Ćosić, very important neo-avant-garde artist and writer. But among all these voices and on this really pretty high level of cultural debate, there is only one woman voice, and this one is also really not insubstantial in any way. So this is just a little example. That's why it was for us really super important to have this initiative of Antonia Majaca to discuss this particular film from a position of feminist critique. And at the moment when in Austria, since the beginning of the year, there were 11 femicides, and generally the number of femicides obviously increased with lockdown and pandemics and all families and people being confined in houses. And there is quite a debate going on in Austria around femicide. It's also really timely to have this perspective on this film in this context. So I will end here. I just want to thank to many people before I end and give the word to Želimir Žilnik. And maybe first of all, I want to thank Želimir, who is, as usual, generous extremely generous and willing to engage with this debate that kind of tries to address the blind spots in which he also took part. I also really want to thank to Antonia Majaca, who initiated this and with whom we were in a dialogue in composing this event, and then also all the participants, Maria Chehonadskih, Ashkan Sepahvand, Grant Watson, and Reem Shilleh, and Rasha Salti, Kia Malami, and Tyler Friedman. I also want to thank to Lola Pfeiffer and Rafaela Dražić, who prepared interludes, which we will see later. And I want to thank all of Kunsthalle team that was involved in this, and especially Laura Mann, who really helped in organizing this. So thank you all very much, and I invite Želimir. Želimir, welcome.
Hello to everybody. Oh, well, I don't know, should I start speaking alone, or maybe Antonia told me that we should have maybe some sort of small introduction together. What do you say, Antonia?
I'm totally okay if you would like to just go ahead and present the film, introduce it in any way you see fitting for the occasion. I prepared a couple of prompts that we discussed in our dialogue so far, and I can share them with you, but it's also perfectly fine if Želimir just wants to go ahead and talk.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for actually being so involved in analyzing and reflecting this old film. And I must say it was a great pleasure for me, and sometimes also a surprise, reading all those very excellent texts. What I can say now that today, not only because of your knowledge, but also because of my age, you now know about early works much more than I do. But something what I mean, you know, in terms that you are just looking, watching it from very different angles, and from some angles, the film was never analyzed and watched before. As I remember, in the moment when the film came out, that was the spring in '69, there was some philosophers, some sociologists, some psychologists, and also film critic who wrote quite serious texts. But in that time, because we are now speaking about this important 68 and 69 moment when actually the destiny of state socialism was at stake. Why? Because of this occupation of Czechoslovakia by Soviet Union and all other socialistic states beside China and Yugoslavia. But of course, China was not under the threat, not only because it's bigger, but it is far away, but the Soviet tanks came up to our borders. You see, and the reason why Czechoslovakia was occupied is that Czech socialism started going in this direction as Tito socialism, to try to introduce some sort of market economy, then open borders, then much more sort of relaxed atmosphere in cultural production. And we young people have been watching Czech leaders and Yugoslav leaders exchanging not only the letters, but also visits almost each week. And yet then in one moment, it came to this actually occupation, which put the whole, I would say, big question mark. Is this state socialism may be going to die, or would it survive this tremendous attack on the some sort of basic principles of the system? So all those texts in these first years have been reflecting this political questions and threats, and trying to see is the film made on the way that it is somehow giving some clever like answers and even suggestions how the people should defend themselves, you see. So it was taken completely serious, and instead of thinking about that film as like a fairy tale, a symbolic fairy tale, sometimes the film was reflected in essays as actually some political action itself. So of course that was the reason why also the film was so much accused by not only politicians and but also by the court, but by public prosecutor. So what I can maybe say, what you do not know, I can describe a bit some months before we start making the films, and then the moment when film came publicly in early spring of '69. So what happens to me and my colleagues in late spring and summer of '68? First of all, in that time I was making short films, and in May of '68, like other short filmmakers, many also from Yugoslavia, I was having two of my short films, documentary film on Oberhausen Film Festival, and by chance, as it happens, one of my films, which is called Unemployed, was awarded with the Grand Prix for documentary film, which was something always in cinematography hours and all over the world, something what is, I would say, very much somehow regarded. And that led to the invitation in June by actually Avala Film, which was the big Belgrade film company, which most was doing big co-productions, but in the same time, Avala Film was producing 6, 7, 8, up to 10 local domestic films. And each year they have been giving 1, 2, or 3 projects as actually the first film to the people who are either good with the proposal, or maybe they have been spotted as young documentary filmmakers. So without my initiative came this offer by Avala Film, and of course my reaction was not too enthusiastic. As I said to them, I do not have anything as a script and no idea to step in a long film production, but I will see. While I was in this dilemma, in Belgrade exploded or occurred a student demonstration. Student demonstration was the event which was actually for Yugoslav system, and I would say for the state socialism as such, something very, very unique and special by the media and by the whole political strata was treated as some sort of assault on a system. The police was first brutally intervening against about 5 or maybe 10,000 of students. They have beaten them, put in jail a few dozens of them, but in the same time, some sort of communication start between politicians and students, and politicians allow students to continue to have the meetings and speeches in the university, That means on all faculties, and not just asking or forbidding them to demonstrate in the streets. So in that moment, I went with my film crew through the university and spent this week of student demonstration, which lasts 6-7 days, filming documentary film on that topic, and actually somehow being in completely new situation as this practice we didn't have. We have been very well informed in that moment in Yugoslavia due to this, what I say, relaxed cultural politics and very good youth newspapers and students, magazines and newspapers. We have been very well informed what's going on in Berlin and Paris with students' rebellion, and we have been well informed about this civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War demonstration all over the world, and especially in America. In some moments, there was also some solidarity gathering on those topics. But this, what was happening now, was something very unique. On one side, the students have been criticizing the political elite, but pretending that they do it from the standpoint of socialistic theory and Marxism. As first, what they asked for is to rename Belgrade University to be called Red University of Karl Marx. That is one thing. Second, they have been also somehow trying to send a message to our leaders, and especially to President Tito, like a return to some of promises of your youth, some of the promises when you have installed or brought socialism in this country.
Želimir, I'm sorry. I would kindly ask you to wrap this up, because we will have to start watching the film.
Yes,
Completely outside of the.
Okay, I will. Yeah,
so wrap this up. We see the film, and there will be chance later.
Okay,
but please, thank you.
Maybe I shall continue afterwards.
Yeah, no, just please wrap this up as an intro to the film. So these conditions that you are describing, this is all very important and crucial. So please finish it, but then let's watch the film.
Anyhow, in the moment when this student demonstration came, I first time had some feeling that I'm going to put together a story. But of course, all these problems which I just mentioned did not give me any real, I would say, basic idea that I could come out with the script. But just 1 month after that, in August, there was occupation of Czechoslovakia, and we young people, especially from this northern area of Serbia where I was living, we have been asked, invited to voluntarily to go and dig trenches against eventually coming of Soviet tanks. So that was this moment when all this topic, what we have in the film, have been in the air with the colleagues, with my generation people. We started discussing the destiny of our country on one side, and on another side, how all the principles we have been taught in our life before are now somehow collapsing. And actually, the sort of working version of the script was written, and in September, the Sala film gave us possibility to put the crew together and start
filming. Želimir, now I will have to interject also this time. I'm so sorry, because I could always listen to you forever, and there's always new information that comes out in every conversation we have. But we will have to try to stick to the schedule so that we would manage to see the film and still have all the interventions and still have Q&A, and it's a long event. But please stay with us for the Q&A at the end, because that would be also an opportunity to go maybe into details of the you know what preceded the filming and how it was informed by the particular historical context of 1968. I would suggest then, thank you, Želimir, thanks again, thank you, Nataša, thank you, Laura. I would then suggest that we now see the film. Sorry for the brutal interjection, but to see the film and then return with just a tiny little minute break between the film and the conversation that we're going to have afterwards. That means we will basically resume with more members of the panel of our meeting today at 6 o'clock. So it's going to be really tight. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Želimir. Thanks, Tonya.
Okay, sure, thank you. Thank you to Nataša, Ilić and the VHV Curatorial Collective. Thank you to Kunsthalle Wien for the invitation to host this event and for basically in that way supporting the continuation of Feminist Takes as a long-term and open-ended inquiry that I started a couple of years ago after rewatching this film that has been haunting me for many, many years. But after this last round of watching the film, I was really completely taken aback by the fact that there was absolutely no gendered readings of this film. And as Nataša already mentioned, this is a obvious gap that we are somehow trying to fill, but not only that. Anyways, also another thanks is, of course, to Želimir Žilnik for supporting the project from the beginning. He was very eager to you know, converse with me, to have a dialogue with me, but also not wanting to somehow be staged at in the center of the project, which is also, you know, another proof of his generosity and modesty. I would also like to dedicate this event to a woman, a comrade, a person who influenced my early feminist political subjectivation, Vesna Kesić, who was a Yugoslav feminist activist, writer, journalist, and so on, and who contributed to the book that we're going to publish later this month, and who unfortunately passed away this last year. So a couple of words about the Feminist Takes as a project and the kind of the idea and methodology behind it. I always thought of it as a more of an open-ended experiment in feminist epistemology, rather than dealing with the film itself as the end to itself. And I wanted to start with exactly this return to this monstrous scene that we saw at the end of the film. The scene that is obviously so deeply ambiguous and confusing and puzzling, that is the site of this haunting, so to say. And what I wanted to do is to try to gather an interpretive community around this scene that in a way was almost like you know, an explosion of access of signification. On one hand, you have this triangle of a dead female body, the fire, and the Communist Party flag. On the other hand, you have the three men, the unemployed, the worker, and the student. And the kind of the meeting of these two triangles in this last scene was somehow always something that that I thought was just so striking. And exactly because of the striking iconicity of the female character, but also because of the way that she is murdered at the end of the film, I thought this would be an important starting point for a conversation, because it's it also has to do with the fact that Nataša also referred to her in her introduction as Yugoslava. It's important to say, and probably some of you noticed, that she's never addressed by that name, and that name doesn't appear in the credits of the film either. In fact, that name was a name that that was used in the first draft of the script that was sent by the production house to the film festivals and newspapers and the press as some kind of a rudimentary PR. But actually they never used that name Yugoslavia. So in a way we returned the name. It's a kind of also a form of a return of specificity. So now the question is, of course, whether Yugoslavia is more specific or more universal as than the girl, as she is ultimately referred in the last version of the script. So why this film? Not only because of this haunting last scene, but also because I believe that that in many ways this film is like a supercharged cipher of a certain historical moment, but also how it encapsulates all the kind of pitfalls of the artistic and gender politics in this post-revolutionary left of the late 60s, and how these pitfalls are somehow stretched to this day, I would say. So Feminist Takes is then also has the wider implications for the entanglements of feminist political subjectivation and its suppression in the context of revolutionary struggle, but even more importantly in post-revolutionary forms of normalization and different forms of reification, including art and film and theory. So we are dealing with that moment after, so to say, but also with the kind of the care work that goes into revolutionary work. So that is a kind of an aspect that I was also very interested in starting this interpretive community. So I use the word hauntology a couple of times, and I feel that it's necessary that I say that in a way it's also a very personal project that that somehow joins the Yugoslav political project and the experience of the Yugoslav political project with the character of Yugoslava in this film. And you know, I use this word somewhat reluctantly, but at the same time, it perfectly fits the way we always did Feminist Takes so far, in a very, you know, intense encounter of interlocutors in a space together, and rewatching the film, and always kind of going back to different scenes and doing a kind of a public remontage of the film together collectively. And I was reminded recently while rereading Avery Gordon's writing on haunting, how she says that being haunted draws us effectively and sometimes against our will, and always a bit magically, into the structure of feeling of reality we come to experience, not as a cold knowledge, but as a transformative recognition. And I guess somewhat melodramatically, you know, the kind of dealing with the Yugoslava as a character in Žilnik's early works, and returning to Yugoslavia and its own ghostly matters, you know, became in a way a heuristic of its own for me, and kind of joined in this kind of feminist hauntology of its in its own right. So this in a way is you know, a continuation of this process, because it really is a process, and it's something between exorcism and a group analysis and many different things. And when I said the thing about the name Yugoslava versus a girl, that obviously also is an important aspect to think about when thinking about this last scene. Are we seeing the murder of an allegory for a state project one way or another, or are we actually witnessing a murder of a woman of another girl in the long history of femicide. And in this sense, I'm you know, always a little bit reluctant to make big claims about or big interpretations of this film and this scene, because it's so ambiguous and so really puzzling in so many ways. And therefore, I'm always happy that I have these wonderful people to join me to have this conversation. Today, I'm very, very happy and grateful and excited to have with us here 5 very cherished interlocutors who are joining this interpretive community of Feminist Takes and this public remontage of the film. The Rasha Salti, Grant Watson and Reem Shilleh, Maria Chehonadskih, and Ashkan Sepahvand. Their interventions will be on this occasion interspersed with interludes, with musical sequences, with a beautiful sonic take that we commissioned from musicians and artists Kiama Lamy and Tyler Friedman. And this sonic take is developing in 5 acts that are provisionally titled Chains, Fire, Mud, Partigiana, and Wind. These 5 interludes also feature excerpts from essays in the forthcoming book, Feminist Takes Early Works, commissioned by Display in Prague, that I co-edited with Jelena Vesic and Rachel O'Reilly, and which is published by Sternberg Press. Now, I'd like to invite our first respondent, our first taker, Rasha Salti. Rasha, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, VHV, as always. Thank you to the museum in Vienna, and thank you to Želimir for making the film. So my intervention is going to be a bit like a puzzle, because I decided to read bits and pieces of the text that I contributed to the book. But in my practice as a curator, I like to always imagine threads. When you watch a film, what other images are prompted, and especially with a feminist critique of or a feminist gaze at early works. I was thinking about my own imaginary of feminists, the references that I carry. And also I would like to point out that I had the privilege to be one of the co-producers of a marvelous film by Marta Popivoda called Landscapes of Resistance. And the character in the film is about many things, but the main character in the film, Sonia, was a partisan, was one of the first partisans. And it's interesting, I think what one of the reasons I was motivated by the film is because of your invitation a couple of years earlier in looking at the legacy of Yugoslav cinema with a feminist motivation or with a feminist consciousness. So I will share my screen. Okay, so my text was titled My Yugoslavas in Beirut. And I thought I would this is like going through the completely haphazard archive of feminist moments these are the references that made me who I am, basically. Women protesting in front of the parliament, the first Lebanese woman elected to parliament. The Women's Union very actively participating in political life. And this is an image that I will go back to because it's very relevant. It's the most important worker protest and strike in the history of Lebanon. And it started with the Ghandour factory workers that they produce biscuits and cookies and pastries. But most of the workers were women. And the strike really invigorated the left and the workers' movement. Another important strike by the Women's Union against the rising cost of living in 1974. So, and then these two very well-known women who were actively engaged in the military struggle. On the left is Sohab Shara, who attempted to kill an Israeli general who had invaded South Lebanon. She didn't succeed, and she was captured, and she spent several decades in jail, but she was released. And on the right is another woman who tried to also assassinate an Israeli commander in South Lebanon, and she was killed. She was the first suicide kamikaze, basically. Her name is Sana Mhaidli. The woman on the left is Sohab Shara. These are the images, and these are the protests that were led by women in the aftermath of the civil war. This was in 2013, is a protest in favor of civil marriage, because in Lebanon, only religious institutions can officiate marriage. Protests against a law that exonerates marital rape. that was revoked. This protest was in 2016. Another protest in favor of the rights of domestic workers, of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon who operate under a system that's very close to slavery. And last but not least, which basically has a relationship with my text, is protests by women and all sorts of LGBTQ groups in Lebanon, fighting for gay rights, but also for women's rights and against, basically against violence perpetrated and discrimination against them. And this you probably know, this is from 2019, the massive insurgency that captured Lebanon on October 17th, a propitious date. In the first days of the protest, a woman was assaulted by the bodyguard of a political figure, and she kicked him back, and she became an icon, and this became a logo. So these are like, you know, kind of a completely disparate flipping through my head of the images. But what I wanted to talk about is this film, which basically I also was involved in. It's called Feeling Greater Than Love. It was released in 2017. It's directed by Maria Chehonadskih, a Lebanese filmmaker who's now living in the United States. And the film tried to resurrect the memory of the 1972 protest in the Randour factory. And I think if I was to tell you why, if I was to explain why it's here and what the filmmaker tried to do, I think she interviewed a lot of Yugoslavas, basically. The film, the strike has practically no archives. So she had to rely on a lot of first-person testimony. And when the film was released, she really interviewed a lot of women and fewer men. And when the film was released, it was received with a lot of anger in Lebanon. And the anger was only by men. These are two women who appear. These are two basically screen captures from the film. And this is, I'm going to read a little bit from my text and go back to A Feeling Greater Than Love. I did not know Yugoslavia when she was 16, 18, or 20 years old. I was born in 1969, the year that Želimir Žilnik was awarded the Golden Bear for directing early works, his first feature. I met Yugoslavia years later when she was in her 50s, 60s, and 70s. I met several different versions of Yugoslavia in Beirut, in women who had taken part in radical political movements, who believed that a more egalitarian, honest, and radical version of socialism would bring justice, progress, and emancipation to Lebanon. They were as young as she when they rejected the expectations and aspirations that their social or familial microcosm coerced them to fulfill. They marched, attended endless meetings and debates, distributed leaflets, infiltrated factories and agricultural estates to mobilize other women to join the movement. In Lebanon, some Yugoslavas left the movement early, disenchanted or hurt by the attitudes of their male comrades. Of those who departed, some married well, healed their wounds, and stored away the memory of their experience as the sweet vagrancies of youth or early adulthood. Others married badly or several times, comrades from the struggle, deepening their wounds, their disenchantment, souring into bitterness, and a manifest sense of betrayal. While others married earnestly, finding the strength to forge their own path with irony but generosity. To them, looking back is not as painful, and looking forward is still energizing. I was surrounded by so many of these Yugoslavas. I drank their stories, imagined them young. I constructed scenes, channeled their sense of loss and disenchantment. I idealized that moment in history, that chapter they forged in their own hands, and felt in turn that my life was doomed to be smaller than theirs, because there was no way I could live anything close to 1968 in my own life. The world I inherited from them was in ruins, ideologically bankrupt, morally conflicted, corroded by cynicism and gouged by neoliberal capitalism. It took some time, insight, and sobering tragedies for me to understand that I had internalized their melancholy or loss or failure, that I had not experienced myself, and that my own reality beckoned for a different political imaginary, language, subjectivity, and mode of action. This realization was, in a way, an emancipation. So going back to a feeling greater than love, Mary was interested in transmission. And I think even though there are not enough texts, even though there are not enough archives, the transmission happens anyway. And this rethinking, this moment of emancipation, this moment of reckoning that I experienced and that was emancipatory led me precisely to what I showed you. That basically for a feminist, for our feminist movement to grow, to continue, we needed to free ourselves from the scripture of Western feminisms, that we needed to talk about the body and the politics of the body, that the vision could not be simply about gender, but about heteronormativity and patriarchy. And when I was part of these protests that you see in the picture, I felt that building a new society was not only possible, but the plurality was emancipating. I don't know. The notion of difference is fundamental to being together, to creating community. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say. And I would love to hear the rest. Thank you.
Izvršen! Verio dobro! Služimo narodu!
I would like to now invite Grant Watson and Reem Shilleh to offer their take for today. I think Grant is going to give a couple of words introduction, then we're going to listen to an audio piece that they did, and then they're going to have a short exchange. Grant, is Grant here?
Yep.
Great.
I'm here. Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you. I'm just going to, Antonia, do you want to just keep an eye on the time and just chat?
We're good. We're good with the time.
Okay. So anyway, thank you so much for inviting me to make a take on the film. I was very honored. And also it was really great to engage with this film and subsequently other films by Žilnik. I have to say, when I was invited, I was sort of wondering what I could contribute, not being a film critic or knowing so much about the context that the film was made in. But one thing that I have been working on for since about 2012 is a series of interviews which generally are looking at the relationship between politics and biography from a queer and feminist perspective. So my idea that I proposed to Antonia was to use the opportunity to have a couple of conversations around the film with people who might have particular insights into the film. And so the two people that I spoke to, one was my ex-partner, somebody called Sinisha Savage, who is a psychotherapist living in London, but he was born in Vojvodina and went to art school in Novi Sad. And our conversation really talked about, you know, his experience as a queer person, as an artist, as somebody kind of critiquing socialism from within socialism, but from a generation after Žilnik, or two generations perhaps. And then a little bit about his fleeing Yugoslavia and the kind of emotions that the film provoked. It was a very kind of personal interview. And then the other person that I thought of was Reem Shilleh, who's here with us today, who I've interviewed previously, and is somebody who seemed really perfect to comment on this film. She's a curator and researcher in militant film, particularly from the Palestinian Revolution, but she also grew up in a village in, I think, what is now southern Serbia. And so our conversation began with this scene with Yugoslava conducting this workshop on reproductive health with the village women. And then it extended from there to think about militant women in revolutionary contexts. And then we took a step out of the film into another context, which you'll hear in the sound piece. And so the conversations basically were recorded and transcribed. And then what I did out of these sort of two conversations with each interviewee was condense them into a narrative and then record them with a voice actor so that I could present them today. We don't, unfortunately, have time to play both of them. So we're going to focus on Reem's recording today. So if we could play that, my question is, will it work? And if it doesn't work, maybe I can play it from my laptop, but should we try and then act accordingly?
Yugoslavia started to fall apart when I was about 9, but the actual crumbling of the state body had started before. And even as I was listening to it, just the script of the film is super familiar. All of these slogans and songs I learned from being exposed to films and to things that were playing on state TV, as well as the songs we sang as pioneers. And of course, there were stories from Mom and from my grandfather, who was a staunch communist and still is. He really believed in the project of Yugoslavia and all its social and political reforms, and in Tito as someone who created a much better life for all of 5 republics. The scene in the village with the women is very interesting for me because it's a context I am particularly familiar with, because my family's from a village in central South Serbia. So I was trying to imagine this happening, for example, in Lazarevac, the village where my family is from, and how possible it was for women in 1968 to ask these pretty progressive questions. Because in a gathering like that, you would just expect everyone to be very quiet and distanced and intimidated. But then I was thinking, was this also happening, for example, in the camps in Jordan and Lebanon? Because this is about the incorporation of women into revolutionary work, which was important for the PLO and for Palestinian society at large. There were all these committees organized to work with women, to provide them with life skills, with vocational skills, and to make them economically independent. Then on the other hand, just like in the film, you had the women who actually participated in the political and military work as well. Women who were usually younger, carrying arms, being militant, leading operations and organizing discussions on revolutionary theory. In the film, Yugoslava represents a young working class woman from 1968, and there's something naive about her. And I think the context of the student uprisings, it being a youth movement, already sets a certain ground for her emotional and intellectual composition. Then I was trying to think of the women in the Palestinian national struggle, and specifically from the late 60s, early 70s. And of course, the very first person that came to mind was Leila Khaled. She was a hijacker who underwent a whole bunch of plastic surgery to disguise herself. She was like a real badass. She was from the leadership of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a more radical and much further left faction in the PLO. She's not the only one, of course, because there were quite a few women that led these types of military operations, inside of Israel, for example, hijacking buses and trying to assassinate leadership from the military. But many of them died or kind of melted into history. And it's only now watching early works that she comes back. When it comes to situations of transformative political work or revolution, the voice that speaks is important. With Yugoslava, whenever there's politics in the script, it's mostly spoken by her. With Leila Khaled, whenever she appears in films, and these are very different films, of course, these are documentary films, she is seen in an interview format speaking to the camera. She is asked questions and she delivers. She's not scripted. I say not scripted, but I think in revolution we are all somehow scripted. There is this political language that people learn in liberation struggles. A lot of what is spoken to the camera is rehearsed. It represents a party politics and a certain community, but of course it's also somehow this genuine delivery of beliefs and principles. So we know Leila Khaled as the hijacker and the woman who holds guns, that takes pictures with guns and holds knives and stuff like that. And then she appears in this film, and oppressed people is always right. And it is so weird to see because she is just basically sitting on a table in a camp in Lebanon and talking about the importance of educating women in sewing. And it's like, what, Leila Khaled? But it's important to remember that she was an educator before joining the PLFP. She becomes involved politically and hijacks airplanes. She also becomes a spokesperson, so she appears in the media. But then she goes on to work for the General Union of Palestinian Women, and she's more involved in grassroots activities, which is how we see her in the film. So this overlap between the two scenes becomes clearer. Yugoslava speaking to the women in the village about reproductive health, and Leila nonchalantly sitting on a table in a room in a refugee camp in Beirut. There is this relationship between women as armed revolutionaries and their role in organizing women's groups and bringing emancipatory practices to the masses. But the difference is, Leila Khaled comes from an organized faction. She is from a party, whereas Yugoslava and her three men are kind of rogue. So this is why that scene with the village women really stands out, because everything else they've done in the village is rogue. But here you have Yugoslava in this communal setting. And obviously the women knew there was a meeting, and so they came. And then she has this graph and she has samples that she is showing the women. And you get the sense that this is something which has been planned, as if there were a connection with the village council who had agreed that, okay, this evening we're going to do a session on reproductive health. And for the PLO, this kind of organizing was a space within the revolutionary movement for women to step into and say what it was that they needed as active participants. It was also about solidarity, about connecting with women from the region and across the globe. So in that way, it's important to acknowledge the struggle for liberation and the struggle for the emancipation of women are not separate. And today, for example, queer Palestinian groups such as Al-Quds try to think on the same level. Their struggle is a national struggle and an anti-colonial struggle. Their participation is not just bound to being identified as queer, it's this amazing work of just going beyond identity politics that is quite unique. And I think the conditions of being Palestinian and everything that comes with it does give this opportunity to kind of fight being forced to identify yourself as queer or women only.
Thanks. That worked really well. Thank you. So Reem, thank you for doing the interview. So after our interview, our conversation, I read a bit more about Leila Khaled. And one of the things, I read an interview with her, and one of the things that she said was that part of the reason why she joined the PFLP was because, as a Marxist, Leninist organization, they were actively recruiting women as well as men. And so my first question is to do with if you could say something about perhaps the role of the left in facilitating the involvement of women in Palestinian struggle.
I would just can I first give my thanks to everyone for being here, and it's really so lovely to be with so many amazing people here. And thank you, Grant, for bringing me to the interview and then again here into this conversation. I think the thing with generally the Palestinian revolution and all the different factions that that were part of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, emancipatory politics was very important. No, it was a liberation, it was a struggle towards national liberation. So and all of it was somehow the PLO itself was made up of quite a few different factions, and one of them being the PFLP, and then of course you had Al-Fatah and also DFLP and many others, and then PFLP being like mentioned in the interview, being I think kind of the farthest left of the factions, but all of the factions were kind of already practicing some form of leftist politics, right? Even Al-Fatah, which was kind of a political chameleon at some point, that they kind of practiced politics in a way that they were trying to mobilize support in a way that they can get it from anywhere, whether financial or in whatever other ways, to any kind of support for the revolution. So involvement of women in revolutionary practices was quite from the onset of the whole revolutionary period, which kind of starts in 1968, is quite was quite important and significant, right? So kind of bringing in opening up well, as much as possible for that period as well, right? The influx of of whoever would join the revolutionary body. For example, one of the founders, or the founder of the the photography unit with Al-Fatah in 1968 was a woman, and she was also she was one of the founders of the Palestine Film Unit. So, I think the presence of women also in arms, carrying arms and so on, was quite was quite important to, I mean, you know, like to the leadership, but then also like, you know, like to the people, right? So it was something like it kind of, the revolution presented itself as a place where, you know, like it's for all of, you know, like Palestinian society to take part in, you know, regardless of, but then of course, you know, like once the higher politics, the way it's practiced is quite different, you know, then it becomes much more male dominant and, you know, like quite patriarchal, of course. But yeah, I mean, so I think that, you know, like regardless of, you know, like how and at what, you know, like where the factions were placed in the spectrum of the leftist politics, you know, like they were all quite open, you know, like, and it was necessary actually that, you know, like that women are also part of the revolutionary work, whether, you know, like in practice or like in theory or in more like, you know, like political work.
I think the other thing, I mean, the extension of that perhaps is at the end of the piece where you talk about al-Qurs and the way that questions of gender and sexuality are kind of woven into the anti-colonial struggle. And I was, you know, doing some research into al-Qurs and reading their mission statements and some of their essays. And, you know, I think what's really super impressive about that is the way that almost comes first. That statement of solidarity and coalition building is in a way the first statement, which is very different from a kind of conservative LGBT politics, which is, you know, kind of sequestered from other forms of politics. But the other thing that struck me when I read about their work was the way that they talk about the very particular context in which they work, not just Palestinian society, but also its fragments. So working across these different locations in East Jerusalem, Ramallah, Haifa, Jaffa, and that they adapt their approach to these different places. And it kind of in a way made me think about Yugoslavia and her crew crashing into villages and factories and you know, in sort of comedy of that. But maybe you could say something about the work of al-Qurs or these fragments, perhaps, in terms of the recent uprising.
Yeah, I mean, when we last spoke, no, we kind of went into this, like, we started like looking back at just what's been happening in Palestine more recently, like, right, over the past few weeks, and how, you know, like how I mean, of course, the atrocities, you know, like that are being kind of exercised against Palestinians all across Palestine, but, you know, like there's this moment where the Palestinians kind of came totally onto the street, right? Like, what happened, and this will kind of also relate to your question in terms of this, like, al-Qaws's, you know, like kind of the working in the very many different geographies of Palestine. So what happened is that, you know, like, which is something that's actually, that hasn't happened, I mean, in such a long time, in decades, right? That Palestinians all across of Palestine, inside of 48, in the West, I mean, partly in the West Bank, from outside also as well, everyone, you know, like kind of went out to the street in support of, you know, like the expulsion of the people in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. And then what happened is that, you know, like naturally, if everyone's on the street, that means that, like, you know, like all the different kind of, you know, like groups, right? Like social groups were there as well. So like very often, like, especially like in social media, there was a lot, you know, like of, you know, like these kind of statements, I guess, no, like of, you know, like how, you know, like the presence on the street is just simply everyone, no, like queer, trans, you know, like women, children, men, you know, like, so it's kind of this, you know, like these moments of, and this is, I think Rasha mentioned a bit, right? Like these moments of uprising, right? Or like some form of revolt, in the way that kind of course, brings everyone together, right? But it's kind of like, it's about what kind of discourse is created out of that, right? Like what comes out of it. And I think this is something that's quite interesting, like in terms of the work of al-Qaws, because they insist on, you know, like the struggle of the queer community being part of, you know, like of the national liberation struggle of Palestine, right? Like of anti-colonial struggle as well, in Palestine amongst Palestinians.
Also anti-capitalist struggle.
And this is of course something that that I think that's come up quite a lot in the past weeks, right? That it's like this, like, it's not just of course it's not just anti-colonial, it's anti-capitalist, right? Because colonialism anyway, it's like implicated in with capitalism. And the thing with Al-Qaws and the way they do work in these different cities is simply because the fragmentation of Palestine. I mean, geographically it's already quite cut up, and all the different parts fall under different states, the colonial state rules of Israel, right? They each have different administration. West Bank being administered in a way, inside 48 in another way, and then of course Gaza being under the siege. But so the way the land is fragmented already, that means that also there are all these ways of fragmenting the identity, and also the communication. But a lot of grassroots work in Palestine is kind of working against that, right, constantly. And Al-Qaws does a lot of this grassroots work, and of course each geography response is so different, in terms of just social structure and the social fabric, that they do have to rethink, how to work, and how to kind of also function as an organization that works with queer communities. And of course, being queer means very different things in East Jerusalem than it does in Jaffa, than it does in Haifa, than it does in Ramallah, right? They're very different coded languages, right, that queer communities use in all these different places. And this is quite amazing, that this also this awareness of Al-Qaws, that this the necessity to also operate differently, right? And they work from the local context. Yeah. And of course this is all kind of related to how colonialism is exercised in all these different cities.
No, it's really exemplary, I think. I think we could continue our conversation, and we will, but I think our 20 minutes is up. So thanks so much, Reem, for engaging.
Yeah.
Okay, let's continue with Maria. Thank you for joining us, Maria. I'll just give the floor to you, as they would say. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I'm quite excited, and I will try to limit myself and be on time. But if I'm over time, just let me know, and I will stop somewhere. I really have just few slides, mainly to make it a bit more entertaining. But I will try to share my screen. It's just for, to make it a bit nicer. I just also want to say that actually for the first time when I watched the films of Želimir Žilnik was in very different context. And I was very young. I was 19 years old, and I lived somewhere in central Russia, in the town called Voronezh. And with other group of students, we've been watching films, and my first film was The Unemployed, actually. And I don't remember where we found the film, but we had a very good semi-underground film club. And the film scene was quite fascinating, and there was like a Soviet dissidents who organized in 70s, the first underground clubs. And this club survived until early 2000s. And then they had all these copies of these films. I don't know where they got them, but we've been watching, in a kind of apartment environment where in just somebody's flat where this club was. So that's how I encountered. And I have to say that it was early 2000s, and back then it still felt completely relevant, fresh, and would communicate the reality of destructive Russian capitalism still quite well, despite the fact that the film referred to very different socialist contexts. But culturally, this communication between my own experience and the experience of socialism and post-socialism, I always felt that it was there. And I'm afraid my contribution is just on that, because I want to also express this admiration for the Yugoslav film and the experience and this cultural and intellectual and political importance that it symbolizes and signifies for me. So I'm very excited actually to be here and try to engage and talk about the early works. And also I actually will bring another sister of Yugoslavia, the Russian system, which is more towards the end of my intervention. I want to talk about this cultural translation across different revolutionary archives. And I very much felt that, of course, the film and the character and the Yugoslavia is very, very close to writings of Andrei Platonov, who was a Soviet writer and a communist. Now some of his works are translated into English, but only recently. And I will focus later on his novel Счастливая Москва, which is Happy Moscow, available now in English translation, quite good translation. And Moscow is also a character, a woman and a city, and she lives through the Stalinist 30s, and in fact experiences very similar transformations as Yugoslavia. But before proceeding there, I just want to briefly say that not only Yugoslavia, but in general, of course, I think this film is essentially socialist and belongs to socialism despite any other potential. But for me, this is essentially a socialist film. and it refers to experience of a revolutionary context and victorious revolution and all the problems that those experience of actually existing socialism brought. And just amazingly how some of these revolutionary narratives in the film, within the structure of this narrative, refer to similar discussions already in 1920s in different political groups, in film, literature, cinema, in many political experiments. So when Yugoslavia actually says that her mother would be more liberated by a washing machine than a right to vote, these discussions about technical progress, determinism of technological forces, the backwardness of, for instance, Russian Empire, and how peasants would participate in the revolution. This is something, and something already present also in 1920s. And I just share with you here a very nice, I like this very much, the collage of Alexander Rodchenko from early years, 1919-1920, where the collage is called Techniques or Technology. And you see here this horse, which is the old pre-modern technology or techniques, which then also patterns from peasant dress. And this is all together, and some new photographic elements would actually then bring something new, a new type of technology. And this collage in itself as an artistic collage is also very modern, a new technology, revolutionary technology, which will replace the old one. Yes, and of course, it's already been said that actually the scene when Yugoslavia educates the group of women in this context, I imagine in 60s would be something, I don't know how it was staged and how it was filmed, but indeed it evokes these scenes of, because my mother, she was a factory worker and she would attend similar, similar gatherings of women, and sometimes it would be just a boring bureaucratic party bureaucrat, I don't know, talking about something. But here the shift is that instead of this bureaucratic talk, there is a passionate Yugoslavia discussing these contraceptives and other things, which again, something in its format emerges in early 20s as well, after the October Revolution, with similar kind of political, educational, and woman rights and liberation of women would be very present, and similar event would take place. Finally, very briefly, I was also fascinated another political proclamation with regards to kind of culture to the hammer and sickle, of course, evokes, I guess, Maoist tropes on cultural revolution. But again, in 1920s, just before Stalin would seize power and different story would begin, the movement of prolet cult, which is proletarian cultural organizations, exactly proposing to dissolve art into social realities and factories, and they would organize scientific, artistic, cultural, and film clubs. As you know, Eisenstein actually participated in prolet cult, and his first films been made with prolet cult actors who were actual members of this organization, and also they were actors. So this is something just as these cultural parallels, which I found interesting how they translate. And as somebody already mentioned today, interesting that revolution seems to has a kind of script that some archetypes or some narratives are immediately, you know, revived and in the revolutionary moments, and it's always interesting to see how they, you know, how they travel across time and space. But of course, the central feature of this film, and that's why it's such an amazing film, is this kind of critical and pessimistic even intonation, and with a disaster at the end, which you would say something that disjoins this film and disjoins 60s and the moment of Prague Spring and invasion of Soviet Union and all these things would disentangle even the mood of the 60s from 1917, something that you would think always has more masculine, optimistic imagery in general. But again, here is two earlier collages, which I guess present slightly different imagery of the revolution. And then my claim is that within the revolution, and I guess always you can find the tone of doubt, critique, self-critique, and it also has specific features. And one of the best, I'm returning to Andrei Platonov, who was one of the best in early revolutionary years to question being a communist and being actually organizer of peasant communes. He was one to question how things are going, as if creating the utopian space similar to what we've seen in the film, and then pushing against these utopian spaces, different, I don't know, as if creating obstacles. What this commune would do if this and that happens. And I think it would have been wonderful if somebody would make a film based on his novels. So this is very, again, unusual, probably, not that much, but in his novels, it's always something similar happens. In one novel called Chevengur 2629, the orphan Sasha Dvanov joins Bolsheviks, travels across villages, agitates peasants to join forces and to accept socialism, until he finally discovers with his comrades communism in one village. So the actually existing communism, which some peasant community has created. And this actually existing communism, which goes ahead of any party politics, you know, the peasants just decided that capitalism is abolished. And it's exactly this kind of location of the village where crazy experiments take place, and they try different things. Crazy urban planning, they abolish private property. That's why they join houses together. They don't grow anything because they think that now sun and solar energy instead would just provide and food will grow somehow. So they communize anything, and it ends up with a terror and with a strange experiments. And I think this is quite similar in a way to what happens in the film, where the group of young students and with Yugoslava, they try different things. They even go underground when everything fails. Yeah, after they try to agitate peasants and it fails, they go underground, they train in the forest, they try to then join again industrial labor. Everything fails, and Yugoslava returns home to her working class family, and as if the circle repeats. And then she's brutally killed. And I will end just saying a few words about Happy Moscow, which is, yeah, it's quite a wonderful novel. although it's only drafts of the novel. And it was writing between 1933 and 1936. And in this novel, we also, as I said, we have protagonist Moscow, Chesnova, and she's a synecdoche of Moscow as a city, and she's a woman. And she passes through different transformations during the novel, professional and personal, social and political. So she's an orphan. This is a classic trope in Platonov's literature, that they all are very poor. They are not working class, not even peasants, something undefinable, and sometimes orphans. And then she makes a career, becomes Soviet kind of middle class, participates in privileged party circles, and that's where she starts to feel that she cannot bear this lifestyle, and she cannot be a part of nomenclature and party privileged circles. And she meets disabled men, and she herself becomes disabled, and it just, the circle of going through this transformation, dissolving almost into different classes of Soviet Stalinist, context, where she tries and she shares herself, and this kind of sharing, a sacrificial sharing, is also part of this novel, that she dissolves into different classes and disintegrates at the very end, because she becomes disabled. She in the factory, she loses her leg, and she becomes almost homeless, and this kind of decomposition, bodily decomposition and negativity, disillusion of female body into everything. So kind of pantheistic sacrifice is the end of this story. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share, and I think for me this was just interesting to observe these similarities, and unfortunately I'm over time now, and I am not prepared to say whether this is, of course, this is not a feminist feminist narrative in a contemporary sense, but I think that it is not either. I wouldn't say that what we see in both cases is some kind of reactionary. I think it's more complicated than that, and it refers to also refers to the very negativity and the kind of test of socialist reality through this trope of sacrifice, which of course has some uncomfortable connotations, and yet I would say that it has more to it. Okay, sorry if I am over time. I stop here. Thank you very much.
So, Ashkan, hi.
So we can start with the clip and then move on to the audio whenever you're ready. You give me your cue.
What does it take to bring out intentional violence in one towards another? Is it pain, fear, trauma? When is this violence understood by some as necessary, justified, inevitable? What does it take to rationalize violence, to excuse it? Is the group responding to some form of collective, compounded trauma? How is this passed on? How does it transform what it encounters? Is history a story of trauma? Why do historical events constitute themselves around forms of violence? Is it important to know when and how the trauma originated? Each point in time opens up to another before it, a cascading free fall backwards. Is there a point that breaks the fall? A rock bottom? When to stop? When to die? The genus Brassica is indigenous to Western Europe. The lowly, inconspicuous mustard plant with its bright yellow flowers is often confused with rapeseed, a member of the same family. Their blossoming fields announce the vernal season in this strange and temperamental northern land. Cabbage, cauliflower, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, kale, and broccoli are all agricultural cultivars of Brassica, selectively bred to emphasize either the root, leaf, stalk, bud, flower, or seed. Do plants express a place? Drawing out the qualities of water and mineral from the earth in which they grow, taking in the qualities of air and light that reaches them from the sky, surely they must articulate the elemental constitution of their environment. Would this reveal something about Europe, its native taste, its proper smell? Bitter, pungent, sulfurous, sometimes sweet, sometimes sharp, stinky if overheated. Imagine having nothing else to eat. Who do you then become?
Svi pravi revolucionari dobijaju dnevnice kad idu na teren. Šta li bi tek tražili da ovako konjošu?
Idiotska situacija. Kome mi da podnesemo obračun?
Zato nas niko i ne uzima ozbiljno. Bauk kruži Evropom, bauk komunizma. Sve sile stare Evrope sjedinile su se u svetu hajku protiv toga bauka. Komunisti odbijaju s prezirom da kriju svoje poglede i namere. Oni izjavljuju otvoreno da se njihovi ciljevi mogu postići samo nasilnim rušenjem čitavog dosadašnjeg društvenog poretka. Neka vladajuće klase drhte pred komunističkom revolucijom. U njoj proleteri nemaju šta da izgube sem svojih okova, a dobit će čitav svet.
Lenin je imao pravo. Revoluciju izvode samo plaćeni revolucionari. Mi smo diletanti. Bolje da igramo narodna kola.
I realized I don't know anything other than the fairy tale of how Europe became Christian. Suddenly, the Roman emperor converted. Suddenly, everywhere the old religions were no more. Suddenly, everyone worshipped Christ. Suddenly, the story skips to the Middle Ages, the Crusades, the Renaissance, the discoveries. Suddenly, there is wealth, capital, kingdoms, revolution, until the lullaby ends with science. Is the fairy tale there to cover up something no one really wants to think about? A forgotten fear? How did Rome become Christian anyway? Is Christianity a traumatic event? Or is it empire? Is it possible to separate the two? Or does one fold into the other again and again until inseparable? I've been thinking about how the history of Europe is the history of the end of Rome, not so much the fall of an empire, but its transformation into something else, a melancholic compulsion to repeat itself, a failure to mourn. If the migration of its others, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, displaced the limits of empire towards unexpected centers, what was left of it in its turning over? What was taken up? What was lost? Is the history of Europe the story of imperial trauma? Of a people who forgot who they were and who they were not? Of an inferiority complex brewing secretly, shamefully, amongst the empire's once non-citizens beyond its borders? Amongst those who envied that which they could not have, who even after plundering these riches somehow, somewhere deeply knew that their new ownership could not change the quality of their souls. You can't change who you are, no matter how hard you pose, how much you possess. I've been drawing a figure repeatedly. I keep on drawing it. It is a simple outline of a body held in what appears to be light, or flames, or energy. It is the figuration of a radiant body. What does it depict? An act of self-immolation? An instance of spontaneous combustion? Is it an esoteric visualization, another body within the body? Is it angelic? Demonic? Is it astral projection or the soul's ascension? Or is it an invisible presence, the trace of an aura? Is the figure on the ground or in the air? I treat the figure as an impulse to trace, marking out the contours of the body and its extension. I inscribe the figure out of a desire for ornamentation. Is it a corpse or a spirit? Is it burning on a funeral pyre or flashing into a cosmic being? I adorn the radiant body with color, ash, fat, and flora. I am trying to think through the erotics of fire, its attracting force, the joy it generates with warmth, the mystery of its comings and goings, how it consumes bodies, transforming matter into radiance. Is it a fascist thought when I think to myself that I, as a so-called Persian, carry within me the material imagination of 3,000 years of recorded history? If history is a series of violent events, what good is it anyway to hold so much time? Clearly useless. Consider all the cabbage peoples without a name, who wouldn't have been able to survive their cold, damp, dark homelands if they hadn't stolen the warming spices, or everything really, from the South. Clearly, the less you are able to remember where you come from and who you are, the easier it is to steal and pretend it was always yours to begin with. Cunning people know how to forget. In Indo-Iranian ritual, one must always keep one's back to the north, the realm of the great lie.
Napleteno, navezeno, okićeno, sačinjeno, brže braćo, amo da se skupa poigramo, brže braćo, amo da se skupa poigramo. Srbijanče, ognju živi, ko se tebi još ne divi, Crnogorče, care mali, ko te ovde još ne hvali, brže braćo, amo da se skupa poigramo, brže braćo, amo.
Jeste li vi svesni? Ovde nema Šiptara.
Nisu oni Šiptari budalo, već Albanci. Činjenica je, ovakvim predratnim pesmama nekuje se bratstvo i jedinstvo.
I had written a story when I was in Damascus about an underground movement of mystical scientists known as the Pancosmic Whirling Dervishes. From around 1961 onwards, the time of the Belgrade Conference of Non-Aligned Countries, they began to hold regular clandestine meetings. They shared a passionate commitment to revolution, deep knowledge of quantum physics, and a spiritual sense of wonder for the cosmos. During their gatherings, they experimented with the ritual potential of energetic movement, conscious intuition, and somatic vibration. Their goal was to use song and dance to intervene directly in space-time in order to thwart historical disaster. You see, they cultivated a sixth sense for disaster. They wished to save life from annihilation. They yearned to liberate humans from themselves. They called their technique catastrophic transubstantiation. If you've ever visited a ruin, you've noticed how the vegetation takes over the site. The story came to me after I visited the town of Quneitra on the Syrian border of the occupied Golan Heights. I tried hard to understand the propaganda that posited this place as a symbol of victory against an imperial aggressor. I imagined the pan-cosmic whirling dervishes arriving on the eve of the Israeli invasion to practice their technique. Right before the tanks fired and the bombs dropped, they interrupted the event with energetic devotion. They invoked the poetics of all revolutions, with the figure of the martyrs turning into flowers, springing back out of the earth, altered to lend their beauty again. I imagined a revolution in life, how the human body, in a burst of invisible radiance indistinguishable from the visible explosions of the war machine seeking to destroy it, recomposes itself as organic matter folded into and changed by its environment, reincorporated as vegetal life once the dust has settled. Plant thinking, a weak thought, truly alien. To stay in one place, to live off light, to spread in the wind, to be within receiving, to think without a head, to burn wondrously, to know the potential of expiration, to exhale fire, volatile oxygen, quick to ignite. The position of the corpse should have an inner witness. Lie down, slow down the breath, so soft, so slow, almost no breath. You must feel air hunger. Press down into the ground with the back body. Hold every limb straight. Become stiff and heavy. Every part of the corpse strives towards immobility, accepting the pull of gravity into the ground. And what if we became plants? Not reborn or redeemed, not purified of sin or released of the flesh, not renewed, not reformed, no more spirit, no more transcendence. Instead, flourishing, flowering, other, even as cabbage and its mustard ancestors, blooming blonde, livening up the grassy swamps of the north each spring with boundless color.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was a challenge for everybody, I think, to do this in this way, in such a kind of a rigid and restricted way. But I think we managed, and I think a lot of things opened up, and a lot of kind of threads, completely new threads of potential further inquiry also somehow formed, which I'm very, very excited about. There's so much we could talk about now. Like I could just stay with all of you and like talk for hours about each of your takes and contributions. So thank you, everybody, again. I would maybe just see, so how are we collecting the questions? Are we collecting them in chat, or Laura, are you going to be in charge of that?
Yes. So if there are any questions, please write them into the chat and I will read them out loud. Maybe I will just mention one comment that was already made at an earlier point, I think during your introduction, Antonia, by Diana Jelacha, to the panelists who just she wrote that she wanted to point out that in the book Shadow Citizens that was edited by BHW, there was a chapter authored by her on gender and sexuality in Želimir Žilnik's films, including a discussion, of course, also of early works. So I guess just to add that there have been, of course, already some discussions in this direction.
Well, maybe I should just clarify that when I said that there were no feminist kind of readings of this film, nor of the Yugoslav new film in general, which is often referred to as the Black Wave film. It's a controversial term. I won't go into details now. But in any case, what I said is that simply I was shocked that most of the, let's say, gendered readings of Yugoslav film were devoted to the kind of the official film, not this dissident tendency in Yugoslav film of the late 60s and early 70s. And I was referring to the period when the film was made, including the foreign press, I have to say, because obviously gender issue and women liberation did not feature in the Yugoslav 68, at least not in any way that would have resonated immediately in the historical context and in Yugoslavia, and also for much longer. So even though there has been some sporadic attempts to kind of go into that, I think most prominently by Svetlana Slapšak on a couple of occasions. I'm talking about the earlier period. Mostly this critique is completely missing. And of course, I know about this more recent attempt by Diana, and I'm very glad this happened, and this text was also commissioned, but this is from this year, right? I'm talking about like the 50-year gap basically between the film and now, so to say. So I hope that clarifies that.
And I was quite curious, perhaps I'd like to say a little bit about the concept of the audiobooks, even if we didn't get to hear now all of them, but at least three, and how they decided to use the sound from the movie and to structure it.
Hi, everyone. The process started by Tyler, Tonya, and I watching the film together and trying to figure out what the key sonic elements were and what they somehow represented within the film. We picked out maybe 12 or 15 different themes and then tried to reduce them down to the kind of key moments that we thought were most poignant. And so those were the wind, the mud, chains, the partigiana, and the fire. And we tried to figure out what each one of those elements somehow represented in the film. So the mud and the kind of struggling and the violence and the tension that represented, the machinery, the chains, this representation of industrialization, etc. The wind as a kind of specter, as a ghost of the whether it was the past or some kind of subconscious, these kinds of ideas. And then Tyler and I sat down and went through the soundtrack, went through the film and picked out all of the moments that represented those ideas. And so we made these different sessions, and then we started to collage the pieces together to try to create a kind of sonic narrative, I guess, for those simple ideas. And then that was developed in a little bit more detail once the slides and the images came through, just to try and give everything a sense of fluidity. So that was kind of the process. On an intellectual level, I think it was more about trying to read the film and what those sonic elements represented within the narrative of the film, and the different takes that all the different panelists and all the literature that Tonia has been helping develop try to focus on and pull out.
Thank you. Yes. And I think The Wind was such a beautiful ending after Ashkan's amazing performance. So that somehow came together just so naturally and beautifully. So thanks again for doing this beautiful work. Ashkan, I wanna maybe, I mean, you were the last, so I think it's the most intense as well. And we had such a long conversation about how you would, intervene in this context. And for me, it was just such a, it was kind of a relief at the end of our gathering today to kind of just land in that soft bed of cabbage, and kind of like just breathe in, just breathe in and kind of think through all of the elements that Kiam and Tyler also worked with sonically, to kind of go back to this elementary kind of appearances of matter, simply put, in early works that are very rarely discussed, if ever. No. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, how you decided to take this kind of route, and maybe just about your experience of watching the film and thinking in parallel with your current research in Oxford and elsewhere.
Thank you, Antonia, and thank you everyone for all of your wonderful presentations, and also for gathering today here. Yeah, I don't know really what to say. I mean, I'm very happy with the cabbage. I mean, it was, when you approached me with this, I was really excited because you brought up conversations that we've been having about fire and the elements kind of in general, but specifically fire. And I had a bit of hesitation at first when I watched the film because, I don't know anything about cinema in general. But also this history is something that I have a lot to learn about. So immediately what I kind of felt in watching the film was associations around the kind of stories that I have in my head, but also began to imagine as well and connect through the film. So I really took this as really a very generous invitation to tell a story and to really think, or to take also this offer of providing a take really seriously as also a creative take. So how to kind of continue on or under or against somehow the film. So I mean, without wanting to also get too directly in touch with it, I have this moment when I watched that cabbage scene over and over again, where, you know, I just began to kind of envision, you know, the borders of ancient Rome, and, you know, these, you know, migrations of people who are like coming and looking for whatever, you know, looking for a better life, or looking for arable land, or access to resources, whatever, or the promise of wealth, or even displaced by war from elsewhere. And I was thinking to myself, you know, like, what must this kind of border zone really feel like? What is this environment? What is its ecology? And seeing them playing around in the cabbage fields also made me kind of think, okay, I mean, that is kind of the essence of Europe somehow, you know? I mean, you know, we think, okay, like Northern European foods, or these barbaric foods, or these tasteless, peasant foods, that it's, you know, potatoes and stuff like that. And you realize, oh no, that's actually all new. Like, what is there actually? What was here before everything else? And cabbage is the answer. So I really just wanted to kind of play with that, and think of a different way of narrating histories of transformation.
Thank you. Are there like mutual questions between the panelists, between the people who are here, maybe?
My question is actually to Želimir. We just wanted to ask what he feels about this long day.
Well, I was not watching the film, so I didn't stay all the time. But altogether, I enjoyed very much this meeting. First of all, I have heard all these very fresh, like judgments and opinions of yours. That is one thing. And then I enjoyed very much, actually, these technical problems we have had. Why? Because for me, it reminds me completely of the atmosphere of the crew making the film. So all the time we have to wait, to have a break because of the technique, because of some, you know, material props to come, or maybe costumes. And different than you, as you are you have been in a new situation, we actually always use very much those breaks to somehow check our next plan, what to do, you see. So we are not frustrated. We say, okay, let's now see, did our decision for the next shot completely okay. When we are speaking about this hill with the cabbage, just to give you an example, of course, in that area where we filmed, they grow very much melons and watermelons. And as you know, melons and watermelons, they're very colorful, and they are also very good for filming, because when you just throw it on the ground, it explodes, and then you can eat it and so on. But as we filmed in the beginning of October, when we brought like a pile of watermelons, they start getting rotten, and nobody of the actors, of the participants, want to eat it. He said, "You brought us rotten." So of course we had this break of the whole hour, asking the villagers, what do you have instead of watermelons, something that they can use it for playing as balls? And they said, cabbage. For me, in the first moment, cabbage was so like simple and a bit sort of primitive. But on the end, it was very much like powerful in symbols and images. So altogether, I mean, it is good that I stay silent, because we filmmakers, everything what we have to say, we actually have said that in the film, and we do not have this possibility to repair it and the freedom to repair it. So, I mean, my explanation are not needed. Only for you who are writing the text on films, just I want to give you one sort of angle, how different our medium is. You writing a text, you are in control of every word, of every comma, of every punct, of actually you can make your writing sometimes like to flow like a river, or you can make it just very strict in short orders and stiff. But we in the making the films, our tools are not only our ideas and not our technique we are using. Our tools are also the people who are actually the main material. Instead of words, we have participants, and then we have to adapt on the characters, on their pace and rhythm of talking, of running, of communicating, and so on. So that is why whenever I read some analyzing of the sequence, where you think director is this mighty God who has actually each sight and twinkling of the eye in control, that is not so exact as you think. So the life in the life and the reality in the film, thinking also on wind and rain and mud and people, that is actually our main material, which is the basement of each image. And we do not control it, you see. We can somehow choose how we will use it. So thank you definitely for this, for me, very nice 2 or 3 hours I have had listening to you, watching and thinking about actually how you deal with the material made 50 years ago. Thank you. I think to add something about this Russian connection, very important. Of course, everybody will say they have been watching Godard film, and the Godard was the main inspiration. Of course, Godard is all over the screens in that time. But actually, the real inspiration for this film, direct one, is Alexander Medvedkin film Happiness. So that is the moment when I said to my cameraman, because of course he said, "What are we going to do?" I said, Medvedkin combined with actually Adolphus Meka's Hallelujah Hills. So this, what you have seen, that is this combination, Hallelujah Hills, Adolphus Meka's and Medvedkin. And I personally met Medvedkin because he was in those years also the guest of Oberhausen Film Festival, and I had a nice conversation with him when he saw the thousands of people, young people from Europe and the world, just applauding him for these old films and being completely silent when he was showing these propaganda films against Chinese Cultural Revolution. So Medvedkin asked me, Želimir, are they American and German spies? Because they love this, my old material, which is criticized by communists in 25. As you know, he was actually expelled from the party in 25 or 26.
I can't suppress the urge to mention the thing, a trivia about the early works, meaning Marx and Engels' early works, because for me it was such an interesting thing to discover that Želimir actually wrote his high school diploma work on the topic of, on the subject of alienation and early Marx. And then, the return to early works in the cinematic way in '68 was also kind of a return to your own earliest work. It's a kind of a full circle there. So that was a kind of something that was also one of the things to think about for myself in terms of returning to early works, and the kind of the topic of return obviously also features here in the film itself, with Yugoslav return to where it all started. So it's a kind of a full circle. And, obviously the most known version or most known interpretation of this end, one of our past participants argued, Antonia Majaca, that it was actually a very masculinist kind of interpretation that she had to be killed because she witnessed the impotence of her comrades, right? So I was just thinking if you could, Želimir, now just say briefly something about the female character in the film, and who's played by Milja Vujanović, who was also a very young, not even an actress, but a student of film organization, as far as I know, at the time when you invited her to work on the film.
In few words, of course, the fairy tale we have been planning to make was a fairy tale about actually the revolution and this country we are living in. And of course, that was the reason that the girl was chosen for that role. In the same time, there was also some of my experiences in student demonstration where actually the girls' police was so brutal that they actually have beaten girls much tougher because they did not reject and they did not try to defend themselves. So I filmed few girls in the hospitals who have been really pissed off how the comrades, boys, have been leaving them alone. So that is one thing. Then the second thing, of course, that in this emancipation of Yugoslavia, the emancipation of women was something what was vivid in many areas, from the possibility to get education and job and to get the salary exactly the same as the man. But in the same time, this authoritarian patriarchal regime that in a family, at home, and in the villages, it prevailed. And we have felt the struggle of the women, which is still full of energy, because actually the goals of freeing them is not fulfilled. And then, of course, as the whole mood in our crew was that we are actually making a blues of socialism who failed and who has been actually dig in the grave with this occupation of Czechoslovakia, and actually somehow the half of the world which was under state socialism not actually showing any real solidarity. So this killing of her was, how would I say, just to eliminate the witness of the failure and the weakness.
Želimir, you are in a way agreeing to this interpretation that she had to be eliminated because she saw what she should not see, which is male weakness, male impotence. Or is this what you said? Did I understand it right?
Well, yeah. Well, that is how I remember that moment. You see, so and even today, when when I watched the film with the new audience, I think that somehow that is what stays in some sort of conclusion, a logical conclusion of this film.
Yeah, I think if I could just add or maybe just expand on what you said earlier, and this is something that you mentioned in one of our previous conversations, how shocking it was for you as a participant of the 1968 student protest in Belgrade to witness the police violence that was so explicitly directed against women. And you know, I know that a lot of these women who were participating in 1968 were actually wounded by gunshots, including Tamara Kaliterna, who later became a prominent journalist and activist in Women in Black, which was like a crucial feminist anti-militarist organization in the 90s, as well as other many women. And you mentioned that they were sociologists or students of sociology. And in my recent conversations with a couple of that generation feminists from Yugoslavia, I came to some names, but most of the women who were involved in the movement, such as the sociologists Neda Nikolić and Jelka Kljajić and Ljiljana Mijanović, they're rarely mentioned by name in historical work of the events of Yugoslavia in 1968. They're in a way, you know, completely overshadowed by their better known male partners. So, you know, you see a lot of, you know, kind of, you see a lot of that atmosphere in June Turmoil, the film that you made just a couple of months, I mean, half a year, right? Before early work. So in a sense, I'm reading June Turmoil as the prefiguration or a kind of a prolepsis of early works, really. Because this violence is extremely palpable, and the way the women who you interview narrate it is striking. And from that, like, you know, multiple voices of these women who were violated during the student protest of 1968, the camera kind of moves, pans to the faculty building and the courtyard of the faculty building, which the students renamed into the Red University of Karl Marx, and which is decorated then with all the political slogans and portraits of Marx and Lenin and Tito. And there you hear this, you know, like the juxtaposition is just striking, because all of a sudden, you know, after all of these voices, you then again hear through a megaphone a very confident male voice declaring that the occupation of the university will be continued by singing, playing music, and reciting poetry. And as far as I know, there some of the women, including Neda Nikolić and Nada Dugojević and others, attempted to publicly raise the issue of women liberation, and a kind of attempted to kind of claim the fidelity to that event of revolutionary anti-fascist struggle during the Second World War, in which women participated in such great numbers. But they were hushed by the male leaders under the premise that the student movement was about much broader and much more important issues. And this is something that rarely, if ever, features in any of the most recent accounts of 1968 in Yugoslavia, which I think is very, very, you know, also telling. So, but I was really prompted by our conversation last time about, you know, you being there in 68 and filming June Turmoil, to kind of follow that path and think about that more, which is like still a research to be done properly. And I don't think it exists. If maybe there's somebody among our attendees who can enlighten me about the existence of any accounts of 1968 from this perspective, I would be delighted to know more about that. Yeah.
And a very, very sad on this topic is the fact that the actress, Mila Vujanović, who was actually very clever, who was full of energy, and who really, whatever she did, she made some successes in some small business and the things. But she was so disappointed when she saw all this pressure on the film, from the court to some very cruel articles. And she was on some festivals with the film in Berlin and in other places, and she was celebrated there, really celebrated as a talented and interesting personality. And we have been friends. So after 1 or 2 years, when I came back from army, she told me, look, these like underground leftist ideas, they fail, they don't work, they are not productive. So I will simply change the milieu I'm in. So she started making friendship with actually sort of right-wing intellectual scene there, who have been very much engaged when this transition came in capitalism. And I was really, as I felt that I'm a friend of hers, older one, I even had a small polemic in newspapers with her. I said, when she was publicly announced that she is like breaking with her previous engagement, I wrote the article. So when she perceived to distance from previous friend, and in few years she was shot by actually one of her very intimate like new businessmen. That is how she finished her life.
Well, that is perhaps a bit of a... Yeah, Antonia?
No, I mean, I could talk about this for ages. It doesn't make sense for me to take the space. The fact that, you know, it's just like a weird coincidence or synchronicity or whatever, you know, to think about the biography of the actress Mila Vujanović and how it parallels her destiny in the film. Yeah. But also how, you know, there's, you know, we can't talk about all of the aspects that, you know, of what potential conversation that the film brings, and about it's as a kind of a, in a way, as I said as well, you know.
So I just want to give example how the life is without control.
Yeah, of course. But, you know, I think it's also very symbolic, and the fact that she herself then ends her life by being shot by somebody who is like an army officer or whatever, ex-army officer, you know, it's just like mind-boggling and just pure horror, of course. But also how in many ways, you know, the violence against Yugoslavia in the film somehow, you know, maybe unwillingly, but it kind of directs us into the violence against women in the 90s and during the wars in Yugoslavia, which is another topic and another completely different conversation to also be had. But yeah, I think we should probably wrap up now, yes, because we are 45 minutes almost after 8.
Yeah, so many thanks to everyone that participated, and many thanks also to all our attendees and also their patience. I'm at least happy to hear from Želimir that our little Zoom online event was at least in the spirit of his filmmaking with our technical problems. Yes, so thanks again to everyone, and wishing you a nice evening from side of Kunsthalle. Thank you, Antonia, very much for organizing.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Very much.